Well, everything started with the penitentiary back in 1866 when it was established, and this would serve the state of West Virginia for 129 years as a maximum security penitentiary. From 1866 to March 27, 1995. When it closed 26 years ago, this was still home to 652 of the most violent inmates in the state. To give you a better idea, about 200 of them had life sentences. That would be life with or without parole. Now, most of these 652 inmates will be transferred down to Fayette County, southern West Virginia, to the brand new maximum security Mount Olive Correctional Complex. But ironically, some of these guys never left Moundsville because over on 12th Street, as another modern maximum security state prison, it's called Northern Regional Correctional Center and Jail. So if you happen to hear me mention Mount Olive or Northern, remember that's where these guys are currently incarcerated. Now, where we're officially beginning your L's tour, this is a non-contact visitation. You all are sitting where inmates used to sit. Now, by the time they got in here, they had already been searched and shackled in the little hallway that we came through that was known as the shakedown room. Then a correctional officer, CO, would escort that individual in here. Now, their visitors, of course, used the other side, and they started talking through the grates until the mid-1980s. They realized that some visitors were bringing dollar bills in here that were coated with liquid LSD, and they'd roll them up so small and tight, those dollar bills could be passed through the holes and given to convicts. A little bit of a problem. Because of that, they had to install steel panels in between those grates, sealing them off, and that's when they installed telephones above the windows, which would also provide these guys with a little bit of privacy that they did not used to have prior to that time. Now, coming into the lobby is quite hard to miss the chair behind me. That is a real electric chair that we call Old Sparky. The death penalty was in effect in West Virginia until 1965 when capital punishment was abolished. It is still yet to be reinstated. But now they did have 94 executions on this property over the years, 85 hangings and 9 electrocutions. Very strange thing to know about that chair is it was an inmate built back in 1950. An inmate here named Paul Glenn was a carpenter, and they sent him to Columbus, Ohio, to their original penitentiary in Ohio to make a pattern of their electric chair. So he actually modeled this chair after Ohio's chair. He built it out of solid oak. For some reason, after Mr. Glenn finished building the electric chair, he wasn't very popular in here. So he had to be transferred shortly thereafter elsewhere for his safety. Now, I'm sure some of y'all have seen the prison movie, The Green Mile. For a movie, it's kind of authentic in terms of how gruesome, very grotesque sight of electrocutions taking place. Now, what you see here is original equipment for the chair. You've got the controls, the late stay phone, and all of this would have been in the execution chamber in the death house. Now, the death house was torn out back in 1967, but when we're on the north yard later, I'll show y'all where that building once stood. Now, y'all are going to see a lot of awesome, gorgeous artwork in the prison today. It was all done by inmates over the years. You're going to get a good idea of the staggering amount of wasted talent. Some of these guys are brilliantly talented, really skilled. A lot of them were very intelligent people. So not just the stories I'll be sharing with y'all today, but the penitentiary itself will lend testament to the squandered talent and all that wasted potential. Right, so right now you all are standing in what we call Main Street. This is the main corridor that connects the south end of the penitentiary to the north end. Now, the north end is where we'll spend most of the time today on your all's tour on the first floor of that side. That's the Civil War era side, built by the convicts from 1866 to 1899. Now, the problem with the north end, they only built it to house around 800 men. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they had 2,700 men, a little over 2,700. So if you take the wall behind me and stretch it south, we call this South Hall. This was built by contractors from 1929 to 1959 to alleviate overcrowding. Most of the inmate population here in the penitentiary was what we call general population mainline inmates. They're murderers, car thieves, and burglars. They're your run-of-the-mill convict. About 500 to 600 of them. They lived in a place called New Wall, down below you all. That's the biggest housing unit in the penitentiary, and that will be our grand finale later on. Now, if those guys had trouble adjusting to prison life or coexisting with the population here, they would end up in a place called North Hall, which was administrative segregation. That was the prison within this prison. It was lock up 22 and a half hours a day inside their cells. So inmates much preferred to be in New Wall and GP. Now, the wall at the end of this hallway is a fake wall we've had built to obscure view from some of our haunted house attraction we have going on this time of year. This hallway is a big hall. It goes another couple hundred feet beyond that point, and you've got 2 more housing units down there. There's protective custody. That was Punk City, Rat Row. Those for inmates who were considered rats or snitches, and for inmates convicted of crimes against women and kids. The housing unit at the southernmost end of the prison is called Honor Hall, and that was for trustee honor inmates. And they're still convicted felons, but they were the most well-behaved guys in this prison. Gave them some extra freedom and some more well-paid inmate jobs. So, when we go around the corner up here behind me at the upper end of the hallway, do watch your step. There's a little rise in the floor up here. That we are in now, this has actually served the prison for a couple of purposes over the years. First, we're going to use our imagination a little bit. Imagine the wall behind me gone. Imagine the wall with the cabin gone. This entire first floor area was all wide open, including about 100 feet or so north of us, and the ceiling was one floor higher. There actually used to be a cell block right where we are now. A 4-tier high cell block of 240 stone cells, what we call the original South Hall cell block. And this would be the area where those few death row cells used to be located back when West Virginia was executing inmates. Now, 1968, the state would tear the cell block out. This entire wide open first floor area became a dining hall. You'll see the window on the wall next to the painting of Merlin the Wizard. That was their old medication window where inmates would get their medicines that had to be took with food. The problem was with this former dining hall and the kitchen was inmates, while they're in here eating, it was not uncommon for them to see a rat the size of a little cat or small possum run around their table, jump on their table, scurry across their tray. Inmates that fixed the food were never given hairnets or gloves, so they're in here eating other men's fingernails, hair. They're finding cockroaches cooked up into mashed potatoes on certain days. They had an open sewer near the back of the kitchen due to the ancient plumbing. A lot of days that sewer would back up into the floor of the kitchen. Well, in here, the ceiling was infested with mice and rats, and when they would die in the drop ceiling, flies would come in, and I've heard a lot of stories how over time, gradually, maggots would fall from the carcasses, fall from the drop tile, landing in these guys' vegetable soup or whatever. It's hard to imagine all of those things in totality. It's not hard to imagine a number of violent riots in this prison's history because of these problems, these conditions. Where you all are standing right now in this former dining hall is where the last and the most violent riot in West Virginia state history kicked off. It's more infamously known as the New Year's Day riot of 1986. Again, that riot started right here. It would last 52 hours. There were over 200 inmates actively involved. They had most of this penitentiary under their control. They had 16 hostages, and they brutally murdered 3 inmates that were considered informants here. The problem was, these inmates had been promised change by the state of West Virginia for years with little to no action. During the uprising, they came up with a list of 15 demands, mostly of improvements, some things they'd like to see some changes with. Governor Archmore finally got here to negotiate with these guys and their representatives, but after a few hours of back and forth with Governor Moore, they only came to agree on one of their 15 demands. Inmates wanted a brand new dining hall that would replace this one, a dining hall with AC and heat, cleaner conditions, and better food quality. The governor signed an executive order granting them that dining hall, brought the riot to an end. In the long run, it would cost the state of West Virginia over $3 million of taxpayers' money to build that new dining hall. It opened in March of 1987. When the new dining hall opened at that time is when they remodeled this former dining hall. They took what used to be one big open room, made it into a hallway and a couple smaller rooms. For instance, where we are right now, this was formerly used as contact visitation. So that's why the artwork makes a little more sense to you now. Inmates that painted this room wanted this to be a nice gesture for the little ones that were very frightened coming in here visiting their relatives or whoever it was. But inmates in here, when they had a visit, they were allowed one hug, one kiss at the door. Used to be a bunch of tables in here. They would come over and then be allowed to sit across from their visitor and hold their hands for the remainder of the 1-hour visit. Now, once this was all remodeled, this became known as the MDR main dining room hallway. The room in the middle that we walked past was a maintenance area and a storage room. The last room on the left here, this was the state shop where inmates' state-issued clothing and bedding were all stored. This us where inmates were deloused when they got here. Strangely enough, right near their clothing and bedding. But the state shop was part of the intake process. We'll make a loop on the north end, and when we loop around, we'll be coming through the state shop after a while. Then you'll recognize where we are. But when this was the dining hall, I'd like to give you an idea how big of a dining hall this was. Again, this is all wide open. From this part of the floor where I'm at on back to that far wall, and from the wall on the right, stretched west all the way by Jefferson Avenue, this was all the dining hall. They could seat about 300 at a time if they wanted. The tiled portion of the floor right here stretched west. This was all a serving area where inmates would approach, get their trays off the warming ovens. And at the end of the tiled floor on back through the new wall and to the left would have been the kitchen. So the thing is nowadays, we don't really call this the MDR main dining room hallway. Many of us who work here now, we prefer to call this the Shadow Man hallway. Now, if you've seen any of the paranormal TV shows that's been here over the years, you may have an idea what I'm about to tell you. This is somewhat of a notorious hallway. That's because a very good friend of mine, Polly Gear, she was staying the night here in May of 2004. This was around midnight at the time. She's in this hallway by herself, heading towards the lobby. She's about halfway in this hallway when she heard a metallic sound behind her. Well, Polly flipped around, and right in front of the new cafeteria door, she spotted a solid black shadow standing there facing her direction. When she put her flashlight down there, she said it seemed as if it passed through it, as if it was a little transparent. But what was stranger is whatever that thing was appeared to acknowledge the light, because it, like, what's this? What are you doing to me? Now, as if that's not strange enough, she continues walking backwards. She had a Sony Mavica. She raised her camera, took one photograph, and thankfully she captured what she was looking at that we call the Shadow Man. Now, we have a picture of it in the museum. Very simple Google image search of West Virginia Shadow Man will yield dozens of results. But see, it was a little before Polly's visit, around the year 2000. MTV was here. They filmed a pilot episode of an old show called Fear. You can find our episode of Fear on YouTube now. Like I say, it's been off air for a long time, but that's really what helped get us recognized nationally as being a supernaturally active, haunted location, whichever you'd prefer to call it. And ever since MTV's visit, you name a paranormal show, and I promise you we've had them at least once. MTV Fear, Most Haunted from England, Scariest Places on Earth, Most Terrifying Places in America, Dead Files, Dresden Files, My Ghost Story, Ghost Stories, Ghost Island, Ghost Lab, Paranormal State, Ghost Hunters, Ghost Venture, Paranormal Challenge, Destination Fear, Mysteries of the Abandoned, Mysteries of the Museum, Stranded. So I have someone repeat this for me here a little bit later on. We've had plenty of shows. You name them, we probably had them. So like I say, 99% of the tour, I'll tell you about operational history and overall history of the prison, but sometimes I do like to touch very briefly on our paranormal history, because we do have a lot of that here. I've been coming here off and on since February of '09, a little over 12 years. Some of the freakiest things I personally have witnessed and experienced is in broad daylight. So thanks. We're not safe. So this was the new dining hall that they built because of the riot. Now, it sounds strange, but the inmates felt they put the effort in to acquire this through the uprising, so they did appreciate this. Now, on a hot summer day, they could be in their cell. It could easily be 110 plus. They come in here on a summer day, it's a nicer 68 degrees. But the food in here was really where it was at, because, of course, by prison standards, this food was downright delicious, excellent, kind of like what you'd expect in a full-service restaurant. Pork chops, hamburgers, hot dogs, chicken wings, pizza. One steak dinner was fed to every inmate here one day of the month. Thanksgiving time, the freezers would be loaded up with around 200 turkeys ready to give everyone here a Thanksgiving dinner. It really wasn't half bad. All that food was prepared, cooked, and served by about 25 trusty honor inmates. And they were paid about 65 cents a day to work the kitchen, which was okay money here. But they seen it as a privilege working in there. It helped break up the monotony of prison life, gave them a sense of purpose, occupying their minds working back there. And plus, they could get a little extra food on the side, maybe give some extra food to their buddies. So, in other words, they policed themselves back there. A lot of people kind of cringe at the idea of eating food made by prisoners, but in reality, there's not a whole lot to worry about because of that fact. For example, funny story, one day an inmate was cooking some soup, a mouse ran by him on the floor. Apparently, he picked a mouse up and he threw it in the soup that was cooking. The other guys that watched that happen got pretty mad. They started throwing pots and skillets at him, trying to hit him. Because it was an understood but yet unspoken thing back there, like, don't screw this up for us, because if one guy messed up his spot and jeopardized his spot, it put them all under more scrutiny and maybe compromised someone else as well. And another testament to how delicious and safe also this food was. Every day, many of the officers and staff would pay $1.05 plus tax, and they would eat the same food these guys were eating. Being from the local area, these guys and gals thought, I can't get a better meal in Moundsville at a better price. But when they did eat in here, they would eat in the corner behind the diagonal wall. That way they didn't have 150 inmates over here staring at them, mean mugging them, giving them dirty looks and stuff. You can imagine how that would only add to the tension, stuff like that, and maybe start a fight or whatever. So that's why they were kind of behind that wall there. You'll see the squares on the floor where the stainless steel tables used to be bolted down. The seats were bolted to the tables. In the old dining hall, they could feed 300 or so, and lesson learned the hard way. It's a lot easier and safer to feed in smaller groups. So by design, feed no more than 150 every half hour in here. That's about half a cell block at a time. Nowadays, these tables are down in Mount Olive. They've been repurposed. But inmates would come in, they would get a fork and spoon, actual silverware at the soup and salad bar, and then they would split off onto either one of these chow lines. The chow line on your left here, this was your regular run-of-the-mill chow line. The one on the right was diet line, where inmates could get their basically diabetic trays, and that was also for Muslim and Hindu inmates. Inmates with special dietary needs or preferences. They would speak with the guys on the other side of the windows, telling them what they wanted to eat. They get their trays in the middle. They'd only go through these chow lines one time, get whatever they wanted, but they could help themselves as much as they wanted to the soup, salad, and fruit there at the bar. When they were done eating, the windows at the far ends are where they would leave their trays. That's the dishwashing windows. And then on the way out, right next to the door, you would have a CO with two pans, a fork pan and a spoon pan. There's actually a little writing over there. It says silverware collection, but they would collect all that there and carefully count each piece before they even slide that door open and let anyone go back to the housing units. Now, if you've seen it in the museum already, if not, you have to check it out. We got a fork shank on display. It shows you how nasty of a weapon it could be fashioned into. So some of them still walked out of here with them. But the officer right in the middle in the gun room would have had a 12-gauge shotgun. You got blind spots all over the place in here. You got the staff wall, you got these columns, and of course the soup and salad bar. But more so, you imagine sticking a 12-gauge shotgun through a porthole about that size. Now that's all you can do with it. Now a few feet off of either wall becomes uncovered, directly in front of the gun room's uncovered, makes that room pretty much useless. But probably safe to bet they didn't seriously intend to shoot out of it. It was more of a deterrent than anything else. Thankfully, I've never heard any times that they had to use it. I think they got close a couple of times but never had to fire. Now this is also one of the only areas in the prison with oil paintings. And these were done in the early 90s by the same guys that painted Contact Visitation. Now one of those guys, his name was Smitty Harding. Smitty was a semi-truck driver. Well, Smitty got off the highway late one Friday night, and as soon as he got home, he said his wife Sandy had nagged him. So what does he do? He murders his wife, he dismembers her, and stores her in the freezer over a week until sheriff's deputies raided the house and discovered Sandy's remains. Due to the aggravated, heinous nature of Sandy's murder, Smitty was sentenced to life without mercy, no parole. In 1995, he was transferred to Mount Olive Correctional Complex. He died there about 3-4 years ago. But he painted the semi on the staff wall. We speculate maybe that's what his truck used to look like. Maybe the guy in the cab of the truck was supposed to be Smitty himself. I can tell you that anytime an inmate or an officer would ask him why he done what he did to his wife Sandy, typically, he would say the same thing. I love Sandy, but she shouldn't have nagged me. It's literally what he'd always tell people. So, gives you some insight in one of thousands of guys that were incarcerated here, and pretty hardcore people, of course. So. Right. It's like it's on the first floor. It's just like, why not let me see? It's on the first floor anyway.
Right.
So here on North Yard, if you look over in the distance, the north wagon gate looks like a church steeple. That was the original prison, where the first 100 or so inmates would have been housed on double bunk beds on the first and second floor, packed in like sardines. I understand there used to be even some war criminals, a few of them, that were housed in the north wagon gate for a little while. But more so, those guys that were housed over there, they would build this side of the penitentiary. It took them 33 years, 1866 to 1899, to cut, bevel, and lay every block of sandstone by hand. I understand that about a 1 foot by 1 foot block of sandstone weighs over 150 pounds. Gives you an idea. A lot of these are much bigger than 1 foot by 1 foot. They modeled this prison after Joliet up in Illinois. Joliet Correctional, if you've seen Blues Brothers with Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, at the beginning of Blues Brothers, Elwood picks Jake up from Joliet Jake. Joliet and Moundsville are both gorgeous examples of Gothic Revival architecture, resembling a castle, with the battlements and turrets and the crenellations. And this was all intended by design, back in a time of the world when they wanted a prison to look mean and uninviting and evil, as opposed to nowadays brand new prisons which all look the same, basically like colleges with razor wire. Basically. The tallest part of the prison was the administration building, finished around 1876. Now until 1960, the third and fourth floor would have been the home of the warden and his families, and it was normal life for him. He raised the little wardens up there and all of them. One of the wardens used to allow a trustee inmate to take his kids to church for him on Sunday and bring them back to him. Definitely wouldn't fly in today's world. Until 1960, the second floor would have also been used as administrative offices for the warden, deputy warden, their staff, the magistrate, the clerk, records office, people like that. But around 1960, the offices were moved down to the 2 floors above our lobby now, and the warden moved into the warden's house outside the prison walls. Now, the first floor of the admin building, I'll hold off on that because we'll be passing through there here just a little bit later. Of course, the metal blue building you can tell is modern. That is from 1972. That was West Virginia State Industries. They had a couple hundred guys that had paid jobs in there. They would work in factory workshops. Welding, electrical, woodworking, photography, automotive. They would convert books to Braille, bind books, and make license plates and highway signs for the state in there. Now, back in 1982, they had a bad batch of license plates that were coming out a little bit yellow. And we have one in the museum. Well, they were yellow because inmates were peeing in the paint. They knew the ammonia in their urine would cause that license plate gradually to crack and peel. Well, they made piecework over there. So they knew that the more P plates they made, the more new plates they'd have to make and make more money that way. It was like job security for the convicts. It's backfired on them. They got their wages docked for a couple weeks for trying to be wise guys, but goes to show you, these guys are clever, you know, think about that. And like I said, we call them P plates, but you check it out in the museum later, you'll see what I mean with that discoloration. So, wacky stuff. Nowadays, the DOC has some offices in there. The rest of that building is used as our event center. If you all are ever looking for a venue to host any kind of gathering, it could be birthday party, family or class reunion, or my favorite, a wedding, give us a call. Usually every year we have 1 or 2, sometimes 2 or 3 couples every year that wants to get married within the prison walls. And you know, when you really think about it, what better place could you receive your life sentence? Now, here's the great difference with that is it'd be a happy life sentence for a change, right? At least that's the idea. So, but that's where ball and chain came from. So, moving on. You'll notice the base of the walls are painted white, and you'll notice that on the north and the south yard here later. That is because back in 1980, inmates began wearing khaki uniforms, and they started to camouflage into the sandstone. They knew all too well escapes were a big problem here. And of course, the inmates had nothing but time to plan for these escapes. Many times did. They had numerous tunnel escapes from here over the years. Numerous times inmates would steal a truck and try and crash out of a gate. One guy escaped in the back of a cement mixer. The walls are 26 feet high. These guys would climb them, they would scale them, they would make homemade grappling hooks even. In 1994, they had 2 guys climb those walls with ropes that they braided from dental floss. A lot of dental floss. Wow. So, but a little over 500 escapes. They got them all back but 2. So that's the only saving grace to that. But the town of Moundsville pretty much grew up around this prison. You know, if you put yourself in that position, if you get out of a maximum security penitentiary, the last place you're going to want to hang out at is in the same neighborhood. So people in Moundsville really were the safest people around here when you think about it. Never in the history of those escapes was anyone in Moundsville ever harmed. The guys here in the prison, they considered the people of Moundsville their people. Sounds a little weird, but it'll make more sense to you here later. But I've talked to people who were born and raised and lived in Moundsville their whole life and said it wasn't unusual on nice summer days for neighborhood kids to be riding their bicycles around the prison walls and to see an inmate jump off the wall in front of them and take off running. You know, if you lived in Moundsville, it was just, you know, kind of normal. So no one ever really thought about it. I told y'all earlier about the death house where those executions were held. The death house used to be a 2-story red brick building that stood on the other side of those dumpsters, right where those fences are right now. We call those bullpens. And where the bullpens are is where that death house was, built in 1899. And until the summer of 1931, you all could have came here on the day of a hanging, bring your kids, pay $2 a person, and you could watch with your family. It was like family entertainment. The Moundsville newspaper would advertise these hangings exactly like this. Pack a picnic, bring your family to the state penitentiary, enjoy a nice hanging. They done that until around July of 1931, June, July, when they executed Frank Heyer. He had sentenced to death for murdering his wife. Frank was the biggest guy they hanged here, real tall, big-boned, broad-shouldered man. When an inmate is hanged, the rope is measured on the inmate's height and weight, but Frank's rope was a little too long. It allowed him to gain too much momentum. When the drop doors opened, he instantly decapitated, and I've heard that his head allegedly landed in front of a group of terrified kids watching. Another lesson learned the hard way. After that, the warden said, whoa, we got to make this invitation only. So from there on out, you had to be a relative of an inmate or a victim or a member of the media to go in there and watch. Now, in 1965, upon the abolition of the death penalty in West Virginia, no longer had a purpose for the death house. Inmates seen it as an eyesore, a grim reminder of the past. They actually put together a petition for the warden to get rid of that death house, and in 1967, Otto Bowles, the warden, he tore it out. The bullpens we got there now, those are recreation yards, rec yards for North Hall. And again, those were the guys that were the most violent, incorrigible, troublesome inmates in all of West Virginia. Locked down 22.5 hours a day. They were fed breakfast, lunch, and dinner on plasticware inside their cells. The only time these guys would leave North Hall, they would be strip searched and escorted out 2 at a time until there's no more than 5 in each bullpen. They would spend 1 hour of outside recreation there a day, take them back in North Hall, strip search them again, put them in the shower, then take them back to their cell for the next 22 hours. Inmates called North Hall the Alamo. They said that it was their last stand, mostly because it was a kill or be killed type environment. A lot of the guys in there were lifers or had so much time on their sentence they felt they had nothing to live for, made them very careless and dangerous. Now, we'll actually move up here on the porch. So I'd like for y'all to get a little closer look at that razor wire on top of the fencing. That's not your everyday barbed wire. That's some pretty special stuff. Look there at the wire. Despite how shiny it is, that is all original from 1987. That is military grade stainless steel concertina wire. That's the real McCoy. That's like what they use in combat areas. That is designed to bleed you out. Every inch of it is razor. The butterfly-shaped meat hooks on it are designed to embed into muscle fibers. If you get caught in that, the harder you panic, the harder you try and get out of it. Basically, you're going to bleed out a little quicker. Nasty stuff. That was manufactured by the Gillette Razor Company. Give you an idea. And now you can tell by looking at it, yeah, it's the best a man can get. It's not half bad. Now, your guess is as good as mine as to what the inmates would do. Where would they go if they got on the outside of the bullpens? Again, they've got the perimeter walls keeping them in here, 26 feet high. But these guys in North Hall would do anything. And they did have a couple guys try and get through that razor wire. They done it on the north-facing side. One of the guys really learned the hard way, because he got so tangled in that wire. What they had to do is they cut a 1 to 2 foot section of wire on either side of his body, lift him off, put him on a gurney with the wire still intact, roll him to medical, and have it basically surgically removed. Now the thing is, that's high tensile wire, so it's installed in like 50 foot or so swaths at a time. It's unraveled like a accordion, but it's under a lot of pressure. So when they went to snip the wire on either side of his body, he's probably digging a little deeper even then. So, but again, like I say, I have no idea where he thought he was going, but you know, these guys would do anything in here. North Hall was hell on earth. You go in here at 2 in the afternoon and it sounds the same way, just as loud at 2 in the morning. You got radios and TVs blaring, guys screaming, yelling, cussing, banging on the doors around the clock. There's 160 cells in here. These are 5 by 7 by 7. And when we go in here, we'll be in the day room, and then we'll pass up onto the cell block after that. So this was the day room for North Hall. North Hall officers would have ate their meals at these tables, and this is where they prepared inmate meals. What they would do is they would take their food cart over there, get it loaded up at the dining hall. Once they got it back up here, they put all the plastic and servingware on these tables and benches. It was a lot easier and safer for them to prepare and stage inmate meals in this area here. When these guys came back in off the yard from 1 hour after their second strip search, they'd start to set them down at these tables till they had 4 men ready to be showered. They showered them in the cage directly behind me. It's known as the gang shower. Definitely doesn't look like our showers at home, doesn't operate like them either. The only plumbing in there is a small 1/4-inch pipe that stretches across the top of the fence. Doesn't put a whole lot of water down for 4-grown men. The temperature and pressure of that water was controlled by COs. So you can use your imagination. See, this was the most dangerous spot in the prison in modern times for an officer to be posted and work. Officer assaults was constant in here every single day. A big assault that would happen in a prison is known as gassing. And that's where these guys would take hot water, cold water, spit, fire, urine, vomit, feces, and blood, or a mixture of any of that, and throw it in your face. Some of these guys have full-blown AIDS, HIV, and hepatitis. The CO's got families to go home to. Let me give you an example. On a February day, maybe a CO's trying to feed a man his breakfast tray. Instead, he throws a mixture of vomit and feces into his face. When he comes down here to get a shower, he's probably not going to get a warm shower. In the summer, when they recorded the cell temperatures on the 4th tier as being hot as 130 degrees, they're not going to get a cold shower. Probably going to get a scalding hot shower, to be honest. Sometimes when the inmates lathered up, if they caused a bunch of trouble, the water shut off when they lathered up. So you can use your imagination. A lot of payback you probably had in here. On the right is B block, you got 80 cells. On street side, the left side is A block, another 80 cells. In here, each block has a gun walk behind the fence. It goes all the way down to cell block. Every cell in the prison side, each gun walk, you'd have an officer with 12 gauge and sometimes also 357
That's the only
mag.
difference, but sure enough.
So we'll go up here on the cell block. You're going to see a lot of cell writing
I
in
think
here.
the biggest
It's all
cell
original
here
to the
is down
inmates
in
the way they
our
left
hall.
it.
It's about
If you
5 by
want your
7
local, be
by
my guest and step in these cells so you
10
have
or
a better
11
impression.
huge ceilings down in the south end.
Yeah, as small as these are, this is 35 square feet. Back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, when the prison was overcrowded with over 2,700 inmates, this would have been general population, which meant they weren't the worst troublemakers and they weren't locked down all day. They're more like from 10 to 6 in the morning or so. But this was back when they had over 2,700 inmates and they put 3 men in each one of these cells. They used to have 2 bunk beds, and they put the weakest man of the 3 on a little mattress on the floor. And I say the weakest because they weren't pulling straws to see who slept on the floor. So, you can use your imagination with that, but that's unimaginable. Nowadays you can go to Sam's Club and get dog kennels bigger than these with air conditioning. It's crazy. Now, after the '86 riot is when this was turned into lockup full time, and that's when they kept 1 man per cell, 22.5 hours a day. The bean holes at the bottom of the doors were where they were fed on plasticware. Very dangerous part of the officer's job when they had to come up here and feed them or give medications. They were wearing riot gear and paced along by the gun officer in the gun walk, because that's when they would have the gassing attacks coming out. That's when if they gave them a tray, got their arm too far in, and then make you pull your arm through, break your arm, cut your arm. Some of these guys were in charge of janitorial duties in North Hall. They were known as hall boys. They would stock up on broomsticks and mop handles to try and turn them into spears and run an officer through. One day an officer got his face too close to the bean hole. He ran the broomstick in the officer's mouth and knocked his front teeth out. That's why you've got this fortification. It looks like steel chicken wire. This mesh on the doors slows down chunks of feces, makes it harder for them to reach through with their hand or shank or whatever. The reason for the caging around us is essentially the same reason, because of projectiles that years ago used to be thrown off the upper floors. Everything from chunks of porcelain from their old plumbing, to fire, to colostomy bags. You name it. Disgusting stuff. These inmates in North Hall, as were all the inmates in the prison, allowed to use tobacco products. So they had matchbooks. They would light fires, trash, toilet paper, plastic, TVs, you name it. The ceiling fans up above, you'll see a dark stuff on them. Well, that's soot from the fires that these guys used to set all the time in here. Just to give you an idea. Of course, the conditions they're living in, 22.5 hours a day is bad enough, but the conditions itself in each cell is not good either. The plumbing is from around the 40s or so, 20s, somewhere in there. They never really upgraded it. And so an inmate could be laying on his bunk and the raw sewage of the man above him could be dripping on his chest or dripping down his wall from his vent. The plumbing was so bad on this first floor, specifically on either side, when you flushed your commode, whatever was in your commode ended up in your neighbor's sink. So by example, if number 9 didn't like his neighbor and number 10, he can just wait until he hears him brushing his teeth and then flush it on him. Nasty stuff. the smell of body odor, raw sewage, cigarette smoke, and bird droppings from broken windows would have permeated this entire area in here. Honestly, it's a miracle. Officers and inmates didn't get sick more times they did, as unsanitary and unclean as this was. But the doors are locked with a 2-stage lock from the early 20s, and they were used even 26 years ago. Halfway down on the doors, you got a key lock. It takes a crutch key. Second stage of the lock is the large steel bar up top. It goes from one end down to the other. This is called the slam bar. It's where you get the phrase, going to the slammer. Now, for instance, if you wanted to let just 10, the officer would come up, unlock the key lock first, and then secure themselves in the cage by cell 1. Slam bar is operated by manpower, so they'd stand down there, they'd move a big handle, and then this guy could open up his cell, but every other door up here would still be key locked. So 2-stage lock is more time consuming, it's very secure. A lot of officers preferred it because it's foolproof compared to electric cells that can malfunction and act funky in power surges, and still to this day this thing works. So it's not half bad. Now, these guys would make weapons in all kinds of ways. They used to find inmate manufactured weapons, shanks, shivs in the penitentiary every single day. To give you a better idea, we still occasionally will find a shank or two here and there. And if you noticed in the museum, we got a whole variety of shanks made out of all kinds of different materials. Now, I'll show you one method of how this was done to make a steel shank. And there's numerous examples up here, so I'll move back and forth and show. But just for instance, right here on number 8, it's door panel. You see this line that runs all the way down? This is score marks. And this would have been done with either their state-issued razor blade or with dental floss with toothpaste on it. They would coat dental floss with toothpaste, scouring, or tooth powder, and abrasive nonetheless. And they would set in here, remember all the time they had, and they just score it like a saw, back and forth, real loosely, so the friction wouldn't burn the floss in half. You'd need 500 miles of floss, just keep it loose. That's why you see it jumped around on it, back and forth. Get that thin enough, you can snap that off by hand, and then it looks like this. From the top of that panel down to my pinky, you see how that's not flush? And then sharpen it on the floor of the cell into a shank. The floor of number 8 is covered with sharpening marks. Number 10 here, right behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Number 10 here. The top of this panel down here, you see how that's missing? It's not flush. Number 11, look at this nasty. It's nasty because how small it is, how easy they could hide it. From the top of that panel down to my pinky, same thing. 13 was cut out by maintenance, so that's a bad example. This would have been a really big shank right here. But 14 has it too. From the top of the panel down on my pinky. And same thing here, down here. So, but it didn't matter how often these cells were searched and how often the shakedowns took place, because these guys could take items the state were required by law to give them and turn them into deadly weapons. Since they had matchbooks, they could take their plastic toothbrush, melt one end of it, get it real hot and sharp. 5-6 minutes later, you got a deadly weapon. They could take their plastic knife from dinner, found on the ground like a needle, wrap tape around it for a handle, stab you in the neck with a plastic knife. These guys would take something as simple and innocent as toilet paper, and they fashioned toilet paper into a shape of a shank, wet it with toothpaste or soapy water, and let it dry. A little bit later, they'd re-wet it and kind of rework it and let it dry, like paper mache. They'd paper mache it as many times as they needed to get it so hard they could stab you and kill you with toilet paper. It's crazy stuff, like I say. I've even heard crazy stuff as wild as inmates melting down plastic water bottles and trash bags and stabbing people with them. Actually, and this is a new one, this is wild. Yesterday I had a nurse on tour from a detention center over in Maryland. And just to give you an idea how creative inmates can be, she told me that she found an inmate that explained to her how he made a shank out of a Jolly Rancher. Jolly Rancher, the candy. What he would do is he would get it real wet in his mouth, kind of like, malleable a little bit. And he would kind of start to mold it, more or less. After it got kind of warm in his mouth, he'd just mold it, and then he'd put it in his toilet to cool it off and harden it. And then he could actually, she said it was about that long. And he was, I guess he seriously intended on, if he had to, stabbing someone with a Jolly Rancher. So, yeah, anything could be a weapon. A pen or a pencil could be a weapon. I mean, when you really think about it, in a place like this, anything is a weapon. So they would make zip guns. That's a magazine or a newspaper rolled real tight with a hole down the middle. These guys would take rubber bands or the elastic band from their underwear and tie it off to keep it tight. they would use pencil heads or matchsticks sharpened down like needles as darts, and they could shoot you through the mesh on these doors with what they called the zip guns. So, crazy stuff. Number 9 has a lot of personality in it. That was home to Danny Alexander. They called him Scrappy here in the prison. He got here in 1987. He was 19. He had an 11-year sentence for attempted murder. He done 8 years here. His last 3 years over at Northern. He was released on parole. He lives in Moundsville now. But he was a tattoo artist here in the pen. We got one of his khakis in our museum. It's got all his tattoo designs all over it. He loved his rock and roll, country music, all kinds of good music in there, from Hank Williams to David Allan Coe, Leonard Skinner, Guns N' Roses, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, The Doors, you name it. Now, if y'all have Hulu at home, there was a Hulu miniseries partially filmed here a couple years ago that's inspired by Stephen King. It's called Castle Rock. If you get a chance to watch Castle Rock Season 1, you will recognize a lot of the prison, including number 9. Bill Skarsgård, the actor that plays Pennywise the Clown, he was the guy that they had in number 9 in Castle Rock. So, you can check that out. And also for the Shanks down there on that side, I almost forgot. I believe cell 5, if you look on the door panel of cell 5, you'll see where a real slender one was cut out at the top left corner of that panel. I believe it's cell 5, should be number 5. Yeah, real nasty. Again, because you can hide it so easily. So, sure enough. Now you'll notice that mesh partition up there, it kept 4 more cells separate from these guys. Those guys had to be kept separate because every time they got around these guys, it ended up badly, sometimes very badly. They were high-ranking gang members of the Aryan Brotherhood, which they pretty much ran this prison in the later years before it closed. Now, the last cell all the way up there was the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood here, a guy named William Red Snyder. He murdered his father and the father of his sister's boyfriend. He got here and he killed 3 inmates himself. Red was very feared by population but respected. They wanted to stay on Red's good side. Red was the kind of convict, he would tell COs, he would say, "Don't get in my way, we'll be fine, but if there's an inmate that gives you trouble here, give me some smokes and I'll kill him for you." That's what he would tell correctional officers. Now, 2 cells back this direction from Red's cell was his good buddy Rusty Lassiter, who was in for grand larceny. Red and Rusty were the only 2 of those 4 specific guys allowed on the yard together for about 5 years. They thought they were good for each other, keeping each other out of trouble. The problem was, even though Rusty and Red were friends, Rusty was subservient to another high-ranking gang member in the Aryan Brotherhood, a guy named Elijah Blue Sarton, who was a convicted murderer. He was Blue's boy, his pumpkin here, which meant he had to do anything Blue wanted him to do. Blue and Red started having some problems, from my understanding, about how the Aryan Brotherhood here should be ran. Some inner politics, if you will. Well, Blue was so sure he could do a better job, he wanted to get Red taken out so he'd bump him up in the game. So he figured, well, I'll give my boy Rusty orders to take Red out because he has access to him and has had on the yard for 5 years. So Rusty got the order. They orchestrated Red's murder in the afternoon, November 16, 1992. Just before they went out there, Red took some Valiums like they figured he would. Anytime he had drugs, he would take them and catch a buzz before he went to the yard. So he gets high on Valium. The officer goes up. The officer unlocks the key lock to Rusty and Red's door, but because of that slam bar, by the time their door is open, the officer's all the way down by cell 1. Rusty comes out, he goes up, he looks in at Red and asked him 3 times if he's ready for the yard. When he realized he was defenseless from the Valium, he ran in there, he pulled out a shank, and he stabbed Red 37 times in his upper chest, neck, and face. He was actually drowned on his blood, he asphyxiated. Now when it comes to the paranormal, I can tell y'all that Red Snyder is definitely one of those guys that we who work here now do feel is an active resident. And I'll leave it at that. people over here too so you can see this wheel in the middle. So this immediate area we prefer to call the wheel just for this strange contraption right here, which is basically an old-fashioned revolving door. It dates back to 1894. When they installed it, it was operated manually. 1899, and around the turn of the century, they put a trolley car motor on it. You'll notice there's a big spindle on top of the wheel, and that would have cloth belts on it. The wheel and the north wagon gate were the main entrance and exits for the penitentiary for anybody and everybody. Didn't matter if you were coming to work, visit, or live here. As a matter of fact, there's only 2 of these on Earth, and the other one is still in operation in Manchester, England, at a prison called Strangeways. Now, if you have Netflix at home, I'm sure some of you do, you may have seen a Netflix original series that was partially filmed here a few years ago called Mindhunter. If you enjoyed Criminal Minds, you get a kick out of Mindhunter. It's a series on FBI profilers. Now, if you watch season 1 of Mindhunter, you'll recognize the wheel and some of the cell blocks down in Newell that we'll see here shortly. So, a little more Hollywood action for you. But the wheel, in addition to being an entrance and exit, it doubled as an extra layer of security. Kept inmates on this side, away from the front doors and upstairs. It was controlled by an armed officer in the cage behind the wheel, who had the key that went, a very big key, that went to this door right here, which arguably is one of the more important locks in the prison because keeping guys on this side. And if you notice, that's why this side right here is flush. That way it wouldn't be as easy for inmates to sabotage a lock or jam it with something. So they just have to kind of do one of these numbers. But that's why they left this side flush. But kind of interesting little... It basically, the wheel is a half sally port, half revolving door. So it's ironic that the security they had installed here in the 1890s was better than what they had installed in the 1990s. Truly. But sure enough, so... On the left of the wheel was the old non-contact visitation. They used it until the early 80s when it was phased out and moved into the lobby where we originally started. And on the right of the wheel, that was payroll and processing office. If you get on YouTube, look up Fool's Parade. That was a movie that was filmed here back in 1970 with Jimmy Stewart, George Kennedy, Kurt Russell, Strother Martin. It's a fun movie to watch. It's about an hour and a half or 2. And a lot of it was filmed here. The first half hour or so of Fool's Parade was filmed here in Moundsville, but the opening scene of Fool's Parade is a shot of this wheel spinning with Jimmy Stewart walking out of the prison. Cool stuff, so pretty neat. Fool's Parade. Over there, you had a U.S. Post Office in those 2 rooms. On the other side, you had a commissary and a leather shop, and for some time they even had a barber shop in there. Now the barber was a trustee inmate, but he was a convicted murderer. He would cut inmate and officer's hair, and believe it or not, as recent as 1995, the public would come in here, they would talk to the officers, hello, we're here to get our hair cut. People would bring their kids in here and go over there and get their hair cut by a killer. But it was a bargain. He'd charge you no more than 50 cents a head, and for the men, he'd shave your neck with a straight razor. But he was a model inmate from what I've been told, done good work. He made parole. Last I heard, he was in Houston, Texas with his news shop in operation. So you never know who's cutting your hair out there. My buddy Mike grew up here in Moundsville his whole life. He's told me a couple stories how he remembers his dad bringing him here when he was 4 to get his hair cut by that guy. If you go in the horseshoe-shaped hallway in our lobby, it's kind of an extension of our museum. You'll see there's a little photo of this little blonde-haired boy getting his hair cut by that guy. It's a very strange sight to see, especially when you know it's not down the street, it's in prison. So, weird stuff. But because of that, the fact that the public could come in and get their hair cut, Moundsville had a very strange interaction, a very strange involvement with this prison. It almost over the years was like a community center, like a maximum security community center. They used to have ball games here. The West Virginia Cougars was the penitentiary team. They played the local high school and college teams. They would sell tickets so families could come watch. It was like the longest yard. It actually happened. They would have Friday night fights where you could buy tickets and watch inmates box each other. If you were really brave, you could volunteer to box an inmate yourself. In the earlier years, they had pen reviews, where it was basically a concert put on by the prison band, and the public would buy tickets. Again, of course, in the early years, they'd come watch executions. They used to have art sales out in the front yard so people could buy artwork that the inmates made. So like I say, when I said earlier, when I was talking about the escapes and how no one was ever hurt in Moundsville, because these guys considered Moundsville their people, that kind of makes a little more sense to you right now. I mean, they really did have a lot of involvement in here, so they felt that they were their people. This is the state shop. This is where all their clothing and bedding were stored, just to kind of remind you. You'll notice how we're going to start to make a loop here. When we walk through the state shop, you'll recognize where we are. We'll head to the new south end of the prison, down to South Yard, and then we'll have our grand finale in New Wall. Really one of the only areas they allowed playing cards in here because some inmates knew how to extract cellulose out of the cards and turn it into an explosive. Again, these guys aren't dumb. There's a lot of smart criminals out there. So what they would do when they wanted to play their favorite game of poker is they would take dominoes. On either side of the dominoes, they'd write 10 of hearts or whatever, and they would use dominoes as playing cards in their poker games. So if there's a wheel, there's a way. You see how much different this side looks with this built by contractors from 1929 to 1959. Where the Cougars used to play all the local high schools and college teams. Like I told you, that's where all that took place. Baseball, football, softball usually is what they had. Now, there were two structures on the south end that was built by the inmates. That would have been the chapel and the bathrooms. Now, the chapel was built in 1977. Local churches donated $20,000. Christian inmates donated the rest. They all came together, pitched in. They had this big yard. They could actually spend most of their days out here if they really wanted. Weddings in there over the years, 8 in the morning to 10 at night, for the most part, other than chow times and any commitments. That's a way to give them some gumption and hope, motivation. They had this whole yard to entertain themselves with. At times, local track. They had a weight pad here with free weights that they could lift. Mostly it was Christian faith, so a lot of Protestant. Over there they had a handball wall, basketball court, even a tetherball pole. And we made around 5% or so of the guys here was into the creepy stuff. And by that I mean devil worship. Now, they were fighting it in court for a few years, but very much to Reverend Leonard Payne's dismay, eventually the devil worshippers were allowed to worship in the chapel that the Christians funded and built. A lot of drama about that back in the 80s, so. But nonetheless, a lot of activity over there. The bathrooms looked a lot different when the inmates built them. They built them from the walls, or they built the walls, I should say, from the floor to the ceiling. It was enclosed, it looked normal, it was private. But that was the problem. It was a private bathroom in the middle of a maximum security prison yard. You can figure that out. And anything they didn't want to get caught doing, a lot of shady, sketchy stuff happened in there. Really nasty stuff happened in there. And it got so out of hand, a guy named Mark was nearly killed over where the stall is now. My buddy has copies of the crime scene photos. I've seen it. I don't know how he survived because his head looked like ground beef. He had to have reconstructive surgery on his head. But after that, the warden got tired of the inmates' antics. And he told him, he said, if y'all are going to behave like animals on that yard, I'm going to make you use the bathroom like animals. So the walls came down. Now, it's like that 1 or 2 bad apples spoils the bushel story. Very true in a place like this. But anyway, if you do need to go to the bathroom, we'll just stare at the wall for you. Wouldn't recommend it. Little white room right there, that was the prison AM radio station. A small scale station. It was broadcasted by inmates. They play music, sports games, even news reports. Just about every cell here had some kind of radio in it or another. Matter of fact, one guy in general population here had a $7,000 stereo system in his cell. ordered it from a catalog, so he was roughing it. The call sign for the prison radio station was WPEN. So they had that going for them. Down below there is one of the entrances into the full-size south basement, which is mostly where our haunted house attraction is located. And by the way, any of y'all coming back for the haunted house tonight? No one? Wow, no one on the last tour, no one on this one's coming back. Well, if you feel extra spooky later, you want to come by, we'll throw you in a coffin and send you to Hades, and then you have to cross the river Styx. Anyway, they really do a good job with the haunt. It takes you almost an hour to make it through. A few years ago, Scare Factor came through. They ranked us 6th in America. It's not half bad. But there's an indoor recreation room down there that was used for these guys on bad weather days. It was like a pool hall. They had pool tables, ping pong tables, couches, arcade games, even a bowling machine. They had different colored light bulbs in there, had it painted psychedelic colors. The problem was, kind of like the bathrooms, it was an area that had very little supervision. And so because of that, a lot of under the radar shady stuff went on in there. And that's why the inmates called it the Sugar Shack. So, and the rest is history. It was a sweet place to be. Just leave it at that. So, it's a little different looking in here. We don't got all the fortification like North Hall had with all the caging. But this, again, this was general population housing, the biggest in the prison. You got 320 cells in here on 4 cell blocks. You got J block, K block, down below it's L block and M block. So this is twice the size of North Hall, basically. Some of these cells are 1-man, some were 2-man cells. These are 5 by 7, but they're about a foot or so taller than the North Hall cells. Each block had a gang shower behind the center wall. They could shower as many as 9 inmates at once. The guys on the second floor were a willing audience if they wanted to be. No, some kind of noise all the time going on if you were an inmate. So like I say, I don't want to say they had it nice. They had it a lot better. These guys were only locked down from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. What they would do is they'd open up all these cell doors every hour on the hour for 10 minutes. That was known as the 10-minute run, which gave inmates a 10-minute window of time to move elsewhere in the prison or be back in their cells. So if they wanted to go to the yard or come back from the yard, they could do that then. Or go to industry building, go to commissary, law library, wherever. If they had a dentist appointment at 1:30, since that's between those runs, they could have a hallway pass. They did have a system of that. So despite the COs being outnumbered by these guys drastically, they ran things pretty tight considering. Very similar to what I've been told as being like a Navy traffic pattern. These guys knew when to wake up, when to shower, when to go eat, when to work, school. There's less room for misunderstandings. So, if you watch Castle Rock on Hulu or Mindhunter on Netflix, you'll recognize J and L blocks. They're filmed extensively on these sides for those shows. They're the ones that painted this gray color you see. This isn't the way it looked years ago. If you look in the middle here, what we call the break, all the way up on the 4th tier of the break, you'll see how that color changes. That's basically what all this used to look like, essentially. So, kind of a red, and some of it's like lime green and yellow, kind of weird colors. So,